Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a while back, we took a look at the channel Chat History and their video on evil kings who did evil things. And I'll put a link up at the end of the video so you can check that one out if you didn't previously see it. But now he's got one, History's Evil Queens and Their Evil Schemes. This one came out 2 weeks ago, so I'll put a link down in the description. You can check it out without my commentary. We'll see what queens he covers and talk a little bit more about those topics. I want to thank David Johnson in Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. We could not do this without you. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Evil queens and their evil schemes.
Well, that's a stretch.
Oh, Mary.
When you come across big bad figures in history, you might wonder if their infamous traits get passed on to their children. In the case of Mary Tudor, daughter of certified neckbeard King Henry VIII, the apple didn't fall far from the royal tree, but not for the reasons you may expect.
Now, here's the deal with Henry VIII, though, which is her father. She is the only living adult child, a child that lived to adulthood from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But it's important to note that Henry VIII wasn't always the evil tyrant we think of him as. He kind of developed that later in life, and there's some real questions about how that came about. He was in a bad jousting accident in the 1530s when he was married to Anne Boleyn, and it seems like he kind of took a turn. It could have been the head injury that he suffered. He was unconscious for several hours, but he also received a real bad wound in his leg from jousting, and it festered and stank and sounds like it just kind of produced pus and was bad for the last decade and a half or so of his life. And that may have played a role between those two things and why he goes downhill the way he does. So I don't know how much of that just got passed on to Mary.
Little Mary was born in 1516 and was actually the fifth child of King Henry and Queen Catherine of Aragon, but the only one to survive past infancy because babies are fragile. Henry loved his daughter and provided her with a healthy education in music and language with a strong Catholic upbringing. But the problem with his daughter was that she wasn't a son. So she wasn't seen as a suitable heir to the throne of England. Mary, what do you want to be when you grow up? Queen of all England. No. With that being the case, Henry VIII sought to sow more seeds and give the law of large numbers another go. After all, he needs a baby boy to slam on the throne and bear the crown. And
he did have a illegitimate son with one of his mistresses that he actually acknowledged. His name was Henry Fitzroy being son of the king. There was actually, I think, some talk about maybe trying to legitimize him, if nothing else, but he ended up dying in his teens.
To do that, he sought to divorce the now barren Catherine for a wife that was a bit more fruitful. Henry then lumbered down to present his case to the manager of the Catholic Church, the Pope. "No way, Henry, them's against the rules," said the Pope. But Henry argued,
I'm the king. I'm the one with
absolute power.
And here's the deal. There's definitely politics being played on both sides because the Pope had annulled marriages for monarchs before. So there was no reason why he wouldn't in this case, except there were competing influences. There's Spain and there's France and there's the Holy Roman Empire and there's all these kind of competing political influences and alliances going on. And there are a lot of factors beyond just Henry wanted it, why he didn't get it.
And annulled the marriage anyway. That little act of defiance was a precursor to the English Reformation, which toned down the Pope's authority within the Catholic Church. Instead, Henry made his own church, the Church of England.
Though Henry, for the rest of his life, considered himself to be a good Catholic, he just didn't consider himself under the authority of the Pope in Rome. He was the head of the church, the Catholic Church in England.
Put himself in charge and he was all, nice. He then got himself a brand new womb on legs, Anne Boleyn, who blessed them with a daughter in 1533. Great.
Elizabeth.
Another one. When he divorced Catherine and started slop-flopping with Anne, Henry illegitimized Mary's claim to the throne and stripped her of her royal titles.
And why is that? Because in order to be able to marry Anne Boleyn, his first marriage had to be considered null and void, so they had to annul it, even though they'd been married for 20 years, which meant that he was never legally married to Catherine, which means that Mary's now a bastard.
From that day forward, a seed of resentment and hatred within Mary took root that would continue to grow for years to come. Eventually, Henry got his heir. Little Edward VI spawned into the world in October 1537, but had connection issues and lagged out in 1553.
He was the son of Henry's third wife. That was a marriage that took place right after Anne Boleyn was, again, that marriage was annulled, and he had her executed. And so by that point, Catherine of Aragon was also dead. So his first two wives were dead. So there were no issues at that point with him being able to marry Jane Seymour.
At the age of 15, a short 6 years after Daddy Henry himself expired. Blech. With no other heirs, there was really only one person who could take the throne: Lady Jane Grey, King Henry VIII's great niece. But Mary was royally ticked off, being all... After gathering a...
But if you look at this, at least on the surface of things, you would say, well, if Elizabeth and Mary are both the children of annulled marriages, because he did have his marriage to Anne annulled right before he had her executed, and that's a whole other story of how that doesn't make sense, because what crime did Anne commit if she wasn't legally married to the king? But anyway, if those are no longer legitimate, then the line goes through one of Henry's sisters, and that's where Jane Grey comes in, even though she's not next in line even in that situation. But it's all a long story, and Edward VI changed his will at the last minute to make it possible to put Jane on the throne, but they forgot to secure Mary in the process, which meant she was free to go get herself a force to come take the throne.
Gaggle of supporters, Mary had Lady
Plus,
Jane...
I should mention, I know I'm babbling, but this is a topic I love talking about. Mary had been re-legitimized before Henry's death.
16-year-old dome lobbed off and took the throne. Now in power, Mary's main goal was to re-establish Catholicism as the one true religion within England, since evil Papa Henry played a part in the Protestant Reformation, which diminished Catholic support.
But as I said, he didn't consider himself a Protestant.
To help with that, she went and married Catholic fanatic Philip II of Spain, which was in the middle of the highly unexpected Spanish Inquisition at the time.
The highly unexpected. If you're not familiar with it, there's a joke. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition's Monty Python.
She also reinstated heresy laws and began her purge of heretics within England. Basically, if you weren't or didn't want to be Catholic, then you could just get out. But Protestants protested her authority. No, it's just one word. Oh, that makes much more sense. With some light pushing and heavy shoving from her new husband, Mary decided to fight fire with fire.
And this was going on all throughout Europe, and it was going on both ways, and we'll see that it happened under Edward VI, that Protestants, when they were in power, that Catholics were being often executed for being heretics. So then it happens again with Mary, and then it's going to happen again with Elizabeth. It's happening on the mainland of Europe.
With actual fire. By burning people. From 1555 to 1558, Mary had almost 300 people burned at the stake for heresy, truly believing that it was the only way to cleanse England of blasphemous false religions. To her, it was a God-given mission to rid the world of these heretics, and the people of England would realize in time that it was for the greater good. But the only thing that they realized was that she was a few sandwiches short of a picnic. Her scorched earth approach tanked her political approval rating and tarnished the image of Catholicism. She ultimately got down with the sickness in 1558 at the age of 42.
It was likely some form of cancer, like ovarian cancer. They believed, or at least she believed, that she was pregnant, and they were talking about there being an heir that would be the child of the King of Spain and the child of the Queen of England, which would have been a big deal. But ultimately that didn't happen. She dies at the age of 42, and then her sister Elizabeth, who is definitely a Protestant, comes to the throne.
Because of her violent antics, Queen Mary I of England is forever remembered in history as Bloody Mary, which is also a pretty disgusting drink.
Not as familiar with this one.
If you want your shot at claiming a throne, you're gonna have to start cracking skulls.
The Iron Throne from Game of Thrones.
Empress Wu Zetian would eventually do. Empress Wu officially ruled over the Second Zhou dynasty in China from the year 690 to 705. She was known for having extremely high intelligence, strong political competence, and superior ambition. But history overshadowed her strengths with a reputation as one of the cruelest rulers in China's history.
So you have to put yourself in the position of being a woman at a time when women didn't have a lot of opportunities to have real power. And so, just thinking about this logically, you're going to have to be more ambitious than the typical man. You're going to have to be more powerful than the typical man. And you're probably going to see that you need to be more ruthless than a typical man.
Though, of course, it has to be said that many of the individuals who wrote about her actions weren't exactly huge fans of being politically cucked by a woman.
And this is something we talk about all the time with history, is that anytime you're looking at what's being written, you have to ask yourself, what are the biases of the person writing? What is their goal in what they're writing? Who is bankrolling what they're saying? Whose favor are they trying to get? What side are they on? All of these are factors.
So perhaps some of the stories of her evil deeds are a bit exaggerated? Maybe. But maybe not. Born into a wealthy family with a loving and supportive father, Wu was granted a first-rate education in writing, politics, and music, a privilege not afforded to most women.
Yeah.
In her spare time, she favored heavy reading in politics and boring government stuff, which made her more than capable of holding a position in political power, if she was a guy. But opportunity would soon come a-knockin'.
Why is there a picture of a urinal in a frame on the wall?
At just 14 years old, tales of Wu's intelligence and beauty made it to the imperial palace, and she was formally summoned to become an imperial concubine under Emperor Taizong. This basically meant that she was now one of the emperor's glorified slam pieces, but Wu knew that she was destined for greater things. Every journey starts with the first step.
And so I don't know a lot about Chinese history in this time, but I look at this on the surface and I think, well, you're a concubine. It seems like a pretty low position to have, but it does, at least in theory, give you access to the emperor, right?
After all, the main duty of a concubine was to convert these into these. But Wu never did that. Instead, she would often find ways to openly discuss political affairs with the emperor, something that was certainly frowned upon for someone in her position. The emperor eventually went forever sleepy-bye, and his heir, Gaozhong, took the throne. As a side note, when an emperor died, any assigned concubines that produced no children were sent to become Buddhist priestesses, which is what happened to Wu. But Gaozhong summoned Wu back to the palace. This led to the belief that the two had a history of doing a little woohoo. Who? Wu. Not you. Now in the proud position of top-ranking concubine,
Non-subscribers, actual gutter trash, lowly lady, mediocre mamacita, baddest babe, one short of Empress.
it was time to climb higher. Her target? The Empress herself. Gaozhong's primary wife, Empress Wang, was a bit barren in the bush, and thus wasn't so good at the baby making. So, Wu showed her a neat party trick and shot out 4 boys and a daughter, an act that gained strong favor with the emperor. Even Empress Wang herself adored the children, especially the newborn daughter. Oh, how cute is she? I know, right?
You killed my daughter.
Yeah, Wu allegedly demolished her own infant daughter and blamed it on the Empress, even going an extra step and accusing the Empress and her mother of evil, spooky witchcraft.
I have questions. All right, so I was doing a little digging, trying to learn more about this, and it looks like most of the evidence suggests that this daughter was strangled not long after birth, and that she argued that it was the emperor's wife, his queen, that had actually done it, that she was seen right outside of the room shortly before it happened. Other theories are that Wu did it herself, and or that it was crib death, SIDS as we would call it today, or carbon monoxide poisoning based on how they heated the room. All sorts of theories. We don't know for sure, but it was definitely a story that was there at the time.
And you know what? Gaozhong believed it. So Wang is demoted, and Wu is made empress.
And there's what really matters, is that if the emperor believed it, it doesn't matter what the truth is.
Immediately has Wang whacked for good measure. But this wasn't a normal execution. According to some sources, Wu had the ex-empress's limbs cut off and her remains placed in a vat of wine.
And here, sir, is our house specialty.
I can already tell that this is going to have a nice body to it. Gaozhong continued his rule for several years, but historians believe that Wu was pulling most of the strings, strengthening ally relations and executing or banishing political rivals behind the scenes. While Gaozhong then kicked the bucket in 683. With plenty of eligible sons, surely a new emperor was around the corner. Except, no. Apparently, there are allegations that Wu had banished many of the princes and even had the crown prince poisoned. While she did have 2 sons serve as emperors, she remained the puppet master, just like with Gaozhong. But in 690, sole power was given to Wu, and she was now the Empress Regent, holy and divine ruler of all China.
So Empress Regent means she's ruling on behalf of or in someone else's name. So you have situations where that happened, for example, in England when George III was incapacitated because of his mental illness. His son, who would become George IV, was Prince Regent. He was the prince, he wasn't the king, but he was the one who exercised the authority of his father.
Now in power, the only way anyone could take it from her would be from her cold, dead, wrinkly hands. Across the years, many rebels and rivals took that challenge, lashing out in attempts to usurp her throne, but none were successful. She even exiled one of her own sons after his wife spoke out against her. Any and all rebels were quickly eradicated. Despite her aggressive and manipulative climb to power, Empress Wu actually ruled very peacefully. She strengthened many relationships with allies, progressed gender equality, and eased taxes on peasants, allowing agriculture to flourish. Because of her constant vigilance against enemies, China experienced very few military engagements during her reign. So yeah, since she had
I mean, that's wise if you think about it. If you have a lot of internal concerns, then being at peace with your neighbors definitely is one way to deal with that. Of course, other people take a different strategy. They say, well, nothing will unite our country like fighting against a foreign enemy. So there's two different ways to look at it.
a pretty good run as Empress, it wouldn't surprise me if tales of her wrongdoings weren't completely fabricated or at least overly exaggerated as a way
Certainly
to sway
possible.
public opinion. The Empress fell ill in 705 and was forced to give up the throne to her son. She died shortly after.
Not familiar with this one either.
When
Interesting.
discussing violent history, Madagascar may not be the first thing that comes to mind. But this forgotten stepchild of an African island known for vanilla and bad movies was once home to the Kingdom of Imarina and the Marina people. In the 1800s, the throne was occupied by Queen Ranavalona I, sometimes referred to as Ranavalona the Cruel. A name like that is often earned, like Barry the Bashful or Dave the Dickless. With her reign saturated in the blood of her own subjects as well as foreigners, it's easy to understand why she earned her reputation as a merciless and brutal monarch. It all started way back with humble beginnings. Little Rana was actually born a poor peasant girl with an equally poor peasant family. As such, she had a bleak future just chock full of peasant things ahead of her.
So it's interesting to think about this because, I mean, look at how often women who are born into power, who are born into influential, noble families, still struggle to rise to the top and take real power. So for someone who was not born into those things, it's kind of interesting. I'll be curious to see, especially in the 1800s, how she rose to that place.
God, they were poor. But fate had other plans in store. Rana's destitute dad had casually stumbled upon a plot to assassinate the king at the time, and quickly warned him of the impending doom. After narrowly avoiding a classic comedy death, the grateful king demonstrated his gratitude by adopting Rana into the royal family and marrying her off to the prince. Now, Rana is royalty. Sweet deal, cause it could have just as easily been like, Your Majesty, I just found these plans to have you assassinated.
Good work, little peasant man. I would pat you on the head, but you're just too dirty. Also, I have to kill you as a safety precaution.
Oh.
You understand.
Absolutely could have easily gone that way.
Nice guy.
Oh yeah, real nice guy. Fast forward a bit, the king eventually dies, Rana's hubby prince becomes king, he dies, and then in 1828, the now 50-year-old Rana seizes the palace for herself, murdering any and all royal family members so that no one can even think of contesting her newfound power.
That's interesting. I'm curious to know like how many deaths were involved in this. So just reading about it here, when Radama died without leaving any descendants in July of 1828, according to local custom, the rightful heir was Rakatobi, the eldest son of Radama's eldest sister. An intelligent and amiable young man, Rakatobi was the first pupil to have studied in the first school established by the London Missionary Society. Radama died in the company of two trusted courtiers who were favorable to the succession of Rakatobi, but they hesitated to report the news of Radama's death for several days. During that time, another courtier, a high-ranking military officer named Andrea Mamba, discovered the truth and collaborated with other powerful officers to support Ramavo's claim to the throne. So all of this goes down. A bunch of people get killed. It says Ramavo took the throne named Ranavalona, which is what we're talking about now. So Ramavo was her name before that. Then followed royal custom by systematically capturing and putting to death her political rivals, including Rakatobi, his family, and other members of Radama's family, as much as Radama had done to the queen's own family upon his succession to the throne. Interesting. So it appears as though her husband had several wives, and she was not really the favored queen and hadn't given him any children. So there was kind of a strained relationship there. And then he offed some of her family when he became king in the first place. So it's all just an ugly situation. So it doesn't seem like she was extraordinarily cruel, at least to this point. She basically just did what everyone in her situation did in that country.
Sure, she's powerful and all, but can she make your subscribe button glow? I didn't think so. You should click it. One of her first orders as Supreme Mega Ultra Ruler was to establish Madagascar as a self-sufficient nation. In doing so, she told everyone else to go kick rocks, pound sand, and touch grass, because Madagascar is a strong independent nation who don't need no foreigners. Oh yeah, she kicked out all of the foreigners too. Go
Isolationism. Interesting.
To fully eliminate all outside influence, she had any colonials stripped of their titles, completely nullified all treaties with smelly Europeans, mainly the French, and straight up banned Christianity. Sorry, Jesus. Keep hanging in
Sorry, Jesus. Wow.
there, buddy. Queen Ranavalona sent Madagascar back into the Dark Ages, and good old tradition was back on the menu. Even the justice system was completely uprooted. Forget your run-of-the-mill witnesses, evidence, and testimony. That's boring. Instead, we have this. The trial by ordeal. Simply chug a frothy cup of poison seasoned with goopy chicken skin. If you throw up, you're innocent. So the French were all sacre bleu about Madagascar's isolationism, because they kind of wanted to grab a piece of that landmass.
This is a part of history where that's what the Europeans are starting to do. They really don't have the ability to do that in South America or Central America anymore, or the Caribbean. So now they're looking to Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and Africa.
So they tried to do just that, but the Queen was all, no, don't touch, and kept fighting off the invaders. In 1835, the French made a really big push to take the island, but they were swiftly defeated and had to escargot the heck back to Europe. But to really drive home the idea that Madagascar was off limits, Queen Rana had the heads of French soldiers placed on pikes and littered around the beaches. This caused any would-be invaders to think twice lest they be converted into a pretty cool Halloween decoration. With outside influence now null and void, it was time to focus inward. The people of Madagascar were taught the importance of self-sufficiency. As such, they would only produce what they needed to survive and prosper. So they made guns, and bullets, and alcohol. Hell yeah. Infrastructure and factories were built using mandatory labor. This was a kind of tax that citizens paid through sweat and tears. After all, them things ain't gonna build themselves. As for the Christians on the island, they were executed.
Why is Qui-Gon Jinn on that person's shirt? I guess they are saying that's Jesus?
Either by being hucked off ledges, burned, or by using a colorful method of progressive amputation. Not a good time or place to be a Christian. Many citizens were outraged at what the kingdom was turning into and attempted to remove Rana from the throne. Keyword being attempted. With all of this violence and lower quality of life, not to mention various diseases, the population took a nosedive.
I'm really surprised with all of this. I mean, she must have had some really loyal support around her. I'm surprised nobody took a shot at her, successfully or otherwise.
Some sources claim that between 1833 and 1839, Madagascar's population of 5 million fellas was cut down to just 2.5 million. Not a good stat to tack onto your legacy.
Yeah, how much of that was people escaping and leaving versus people dying because of her policies?
Rana reigned for 33 years before honking her last shoe in her bed in 1861. To her credit, she did keep colonial rule at bay while building up her own kingdom. She just, killed half of her country.
Now this one I am familiar with. Hungary's Finest coming up next.
Yes, I know Elizabeth Bathory wasn't a queen. She was a countess, but her story more than makes up for it.
Yeah, fair enough.
As I said, Elizabeth Bathory was a countess in 16th century Hungary with quite the dark side to her. She is arguably one of the most prolific serial killers in all of known history. Horrific to many, wifey material to some. Now, I'll acknowledge that some scholars believe these accusations to be completely fabricated and merely a smear campaign against her image. But we like to have fun here. So, little Lizzie was born into a rich and powerful family and forcibly engaged this geometric anomaly of a human, Count Ferenc Nadasdy, at just 11 years old. Don't worry, he was 16. This move was one concoction.
And not uncommon, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the marriage was consummated at that point. They may have waited a few years for that, probably at least till he was 13. She was 13.
Acted by both of their families as a way to combine each other's wealth and influence, and it worked. However, being all rich and powerful meant that you didn't really have much to do but sit around and be rich. So sometimes you gotta numb that perpetual emptiness with a little bit of purpose. When we fast forward to 1602, rumors began to circulate amongst the Hungarian population about the Countess's brand new hobby, murdering children. You see, Elizabeth Bathory was accused of torturing and killing hundreds of innocent, wide-eyed, rosy-cheeked girls with the help of her 4 servants. But why, you ask? Some believe that she harvested the young girl's blood for eternal youth, bathing in it as a nightly ritual, like some kind of Hollywood elite. But there is zero solid evidence even remotely hinting that she ever really did this.
Yeah.
In fact, those rumors didn't circulate until 100 years after her death.
And as we've been talking about how much faith you put into stories, how close to the events are these things being said? So if we have initial accounts saying one thing, but they don't mention a detail like she's bathing in their blood, and that comes 100 years later, then you can ask questions about, we can believe this, but maybe not so much this other part.
Others believe that she just liked doing it for the thrill of it, which is much more plausible. Messed up, but plausible. Her early victims were mainly adolescent peasant girls. With the help of her 4 servants, whose names look like they belong in an NHL hockey team.
So János is, that's John. Ilona, pretty common name as well. Dorothy, Catherine.
Elizabeth carried out the gruesome murders. These were nasty, so here's your warning. Victims were commonly beaten to death to the point of their bodies bursting open, with one particular victim struck over 500 times. Others were reportedly pricked with needles and stabbed all over their bodies. In the winter, some girls were dunked in a nearby creek on cold, chilly nights and left to freeze. In the summer, others were covered in honey and left to be a feast for the flies. Elizabeth herself enjoyed putting red-hot metal rods on or in her victims. In 1609, Elizabeth opened up a boarding school for young girls of noble birth. Dozens of girls entered this school, but none were ever seen again. And this was the tipping point. You see, no one really bats an eye when peasants disappear, but when it's rich girls,
there you go.
No. That changes things.
You are upsetting the people with the power and the influence.
And now more people got involved, all the way up to the Hungarian king, who ordered a formal investigation. After a year of gathering hundreds of potential witnesses who claimed to have seen Elizabeth and the gang disposing of corpses, they were all properly arrested in 1610. Afterward, the accomplices testified separately, providing known body counts and horrific details of the deeds, even cross-confirming each other's stories.
And that is important there. If they're confirming each other's stories and by doing so acknowledging their own culpability in all of it, I think we can probably trust that. Of course, the question remains, were they tortured to get this information, and how much did they give up to please their captors? But I think it's probably pretty reliable.
Because of this, historians believe that their testimonies are true recollections of the horror. Elizabeth is often pinned with the body count of over 600 victims. But that's just crazy. In reality, historians believe the real number to be much lower, probably only around 300.
That's all?
Oh, that's still a lot. All 5 were tried and convicted, with only 3 of the 4 accomplices being executed. Elizabeth avoided the death penalty, but was ultimately imprisoned within her very own dungeon, with limited contact to others for the rest of her life. A life that lasted only 4 more years. And that's the end of her story, but not...
All right, that's a lot, but I'm sure that, that's in and of itself a story that you could do multiple videos on, just kind of taking a deep dive into some of those people and some of their stories. So before we go, I just want to remind you, I'll put up in just a second a link to the video about the evil kings that he did that we covered a while back. I want to thank Kyle in Sunbury here in Ohio and Lorenzo in Sterling, Virginia. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. Thanks for watching.